Beyond the Arctic Circle, in the harsh snows of Norway, a drama unfolded that few know about even today. Over 100,000 Soviet soldiers found themselves in Norwegian captivity during World War II. Of these, about 14,000 were sent to camps beyond the Arctic Circle, into the realm of permafrost, polar nights, and northern lights. This story remained in the shadow of large-scale battles and well-known war tragedies for decades. When we speak of World War II, we rarely remember those who slowly faded away in camps at the edge of the world, far from their homeland and loved ones. Northern Norway became a place of unbearable suffering for thousands of Soviet prisoners of war. They were used as free labor in the extreme conditions of the Arctic, where temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below zero, and the polar night lasted for months. For a long time, these events remained a blank spot in history, both in the USSR and in Norway. Only in recent decades have researchers begun to reconstruct the full picture of what happened beyond the Arctic Circle. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany unleashed the full might of its war machine on the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa began with a sudden strike along the entire western border of the USSR. 3 million soldiers, 3,000 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and over 2,000 aircraft. Such was the force of the invasion. The Red Army, despite numerous intelligence warnings, proved unprepared for a blow of such magnitude. The first weeks of the war were a catastrophe for Soviet troops. Entire armies were encircled, communication between units was disrupted, and the command often had no idea of the real situation at the front. German tank wedges rapidly advanced deep into Soviet territory. By the autumn of '41, millions of Soviet soldiers had fallen into German captivity. In the Kiev cauldron alone, in September, over 600,000 Red Army soldiers and commanders were captured. For Germany, such a number of prisoners was not only a cause for triumph, but also a serious problem. They needed to be housed somewhere and utilized somehow. At this time, on the other side of Europe, the Nazi command faced difficulties in constructing the Atlantic Wall, a system of defensive fortifications along the coast of northern Europe from Spain to Norway. A particularly difficult situation developed in Norway, where the harsh climate and challenging terrain required enormous labor, and the local population actively resisted the occupation. The solution presented itself: to use Soviet prisoners of war for heavy labor in Norway. The first batches of prisoners were sent there as early as the autumn of '41. For the Nazi leadership, this was an ideal solution: free labor that they did not regret spending on the hardest work in extreme conditions. In Wehrmacht documents, these first transports of prisoners were called labor teams. Officially, they were considered temporarily stationed in Norway to perform specific construction tasks. In practice, however, for many prisoners, this assignment became a one-way ticket. By the end of '41, the system for transferring Soviet prisoners of war to Norway had been streamlined. From huge camps in Poland, East Prussia, and the Baltic states, the physically strongest men were selected and sent across the Baltic Sea to Norwegian ports. Specialists, engineers, builders, miners, were especially valued, but the majority were ordinary soldiers, yesterday's peasants and workers. None of them suspected what awaited them beyond the Arctic Circle, in the land of fjords and northern lights, which for the coming years would become their prison and, for many, their grave. The road to Norwegian captivity began for Soviet prisoners of war with a long and agonizing journey. After initial sorting in frontline camps, those selected for shipment to Norway were loaded into freight cars, 80 to 100 people per car. The cars, intended for cattle transport, had neither bunks nor toilets nor heating. People stood pressed against each other or sat on the floor covered with a thin layer of straw, which quickly became soaked with excrement. En route, the prisoners were given a minimum of food, a piece of bread and a little water per person per day. Many could not endure such conditions. Every morning, the bodies of those who had died overnight were carried out of the cars. According to the testimonies of survivors, in each echelon, 15 to 30% of the prisoners did not reach their destination. From the ports of East Prussia and the Baltic states, the prisoners were transported by sea. The holds of cargo ships, where people were driven, resembled hell. Cramped spaces without ventilation, seasickness, lack of drinking water, and unsanitary conditions turned the crossing of the Baltic Sea into a real nightmare. Vyacheslav Bukriev, one of the few survivors, recalled, "We were crammed into the hold like sardines in a barrel. People lost consciousness from the stuffiness and thirst. When we arrived at a Norwegian port 3 days later, almost a third of us were no longer breathing." Landing on the Norwegian shore did not mean the end of suffering. Ahead were long marches to their destinations, camps scattered throughout northern Norway. Columns of exhausted people were driven along mountain roads in all weather. Those who collapsed from exhaustion were shot on the spot. The journey was particularly difficult for those sent to the northernmost camps beyond the Arctic Circle. The unfamiliar climate, the piercing wind from the ocean, the polar night, all exacerbated the already difficult situation of the prisoners. Peter Sokolov, who ended up in the Kirkenes camp, recounted, "When we were brought to the place, it was December. The sun didn't show at all. All around, snow and rocks. The cold penetrated to the bones. Many of us, Southerners, had never seen such places. It seemed we had been brought to the end of the world." The first impression of the Norwegian Arctic for most prisoners was the same, a feeling of entering another world. The harsh beauty of the northern nature contrasted with the horror of their situation. Fjords cutting into rocky shores, the northern lights in the black sky of the polar night, endless snow plains. All this created an almost alien landscape for people, most of whom had never left the confines of their regions. For many, this journey became their last. According to various estimates, 10 to 25% of the prisoners died before even reaching the camps. Exhausted, hungry, sick people could not withstand the long journey in extreme conditions. But even those who survived found themselves in a situation where the real trials were just beginning. Ahead of them lay years of forced labor in the Arctic, in camps that became the last resting place on Earth for thousands of Soviet soldiers. The system of camps for Soviet prisoners of war in northern Norway was an extensive network spread throughout the Arctic. By 1943, over 100 camps of various sizes and purposes operated above the Arctic Circle. They were located along the coast and main transportation arteries, forming a peculiar archipelago of unfreedom in the harsh northern landscapes. Administratively, all camps in Norway were subordinate to the Wehrmacht command, not the SS, as was the case in other occupied countries. This peculiarity was explained by the strategic importance of the Norwegian theater of war and the priority of military construction. However, in practice, this changed little for the prisoners themselves. The largest camp complex above the Arctic Circle was Kirkenes, located in the extreme northeast of Norway, near the Soviet border. Up to 3,000 people were held there and in its surrounding branches simultaneously. Prisoners worked on the construction of fortifications, roads, and in local nickel mines. The camp in Alta, the second largest city in Finnmark, specialized in the construction of a naval base and airfield. Conditions of detention here were particularly harsh due to the severe climate. Temperatures in winter dropped to -30 degrees Celsius, and the polar night lasted almost 3 months. Further west was the Kautokano camp, where prisoners laid a strategic road through the mountain range. Mortality in this camp was one of the highest, up to 20 people daily in the winter months of 1942. On the coast of the Norwegian Sea was the Narvik camp, an important transport hub through which Swedish iron ore supplies went to Germany. Here, prisoners expanded the port and built railway lines in the most difficult climatic conditions. The camp management structure was multi-tiered. At the top level was the command of Army Group Norway, to which territorial commandants were subordinate. Direct management of the camps was carried out by commandants from among Wehrmacht officers, usually with the rank of captain or major. Camp security was provided by Wehrmacht units reinforced by Norwegian collaborators from the Heerd organization, the Norwegian equivalent of Nazi stormtroopers. These guards were particularly cruel, striving to prove their loyalty to their German masters. The internal regime in the camps was maintained by kapos, overseers from among the prisoners themselves. The German command skillfully exploited contradictions between various groups of prisoners, appointing to these positions individuals willing to cooperate with the administration for small privileges. The Todt organization, the military construction structure of the Third Reich, played an important role in the system of prisoner exploitation. Its engineers determined the scope of work and production quotas, effectively deciding how many people would die at a particular site. A unique feature of the Norwegian camps was that many of them were located in close proximity to the civilian population. This created opportunities for contacts between prisoners and local residents, which later played an important role in saving many Soviet soldiers. Behind the barbed wire of camps in the Norwegian Arctic, the lives of Soviet prisoners of war turned into a daily struggle for survival. The barracks, where the prisoners were housed, could hardly be called living quarters. These were hastily constructed wooden structures with cracks in the walls, through which the Arctic wind penetrated. The roofs often leaked, and the floors froze through. Each barrack housed 100 to 200 people. They slept on two-tier bunks without mattresses, often even without straw, directly on bare boards. Blankets were issued one for every 2 or 3 people. In winter, when temperatures dropped to 30 degrees below zero, people slept pressed tightly against each other to conserve warmth. Food was meager and monotonous. In the morning, thin turnip gruel or ersatz coffee with a small piece of bread. For lunch, soup made from potato peels or rotten vegetables. In the evening, again watery gruel and 200 grams of bread, half of which consisted of sawdust. Meat and fats were practically absent from the diet. The daily caloric intake did not exceed 1,200 calories. Despite the fact that heavy physical labor in the Arctic conditions required no less than 3,000 to 4,000. Winter was particularly difficult, when cold was added to hunger. The prisoners' clothing consisted of rags of the military uniform they were captured in. Footwear quickly wore out on the rocky ground. Many went to work with their feet wrapped in rags or birch bark. There was a catastrophic lack of warm clothing, leading to widespread frostbite. Medical aid existed only nominally. Camp infirmaries lacked the most basic medicines and bandages. Doctors from among the prisoners did what they could, but their capabilities were extremely limited. Often the infirmaries simply became a place where the dying spent their last days. The daily routine was subordinated to one goal: the maximum exploitation of prisoner labor. Reveille at 5 in the morning, roll call, a meager breakfast, and off to work. The workday lasted 12 to 14 hours with a short break for lunch. They returned to camp in the dark, exhausted and hungry. After evening roll call, only a few hours remained for sleep. The system of punishments was cruel and sophisticated. For the slightest transgression, failure to meet the norm, being late for formation, attempting to hide a piece of bread, a brutal punishment followed. The offenders were put on the post, tied to a pole in the frost for several hours, placed in a punishment cell without food and water, beaten. Particularly guilty individuals were demonstratively punished in front of the formation. Despite the inhumane conditions, the prisoners tried to preserve their dignity and humanity. In the barracks, they secretly celebrated Soviet holidays, shared their last crumbs with the weakest comrades, and supported each other morally. Some kept homemade calendars, marking the days and months of captivity. Others secretly crafted simple musical instruments or carved chess pieces from wood. Mikhail Petrov, one of the few surviving prisoners of the Kirkenes camp, recalled, "The most terrifying thing was not physical suffering, but the feeling that you were forgotten by everyone, that your life was worth nothing. The Germans treated us worse than animals, but we tried to remember that we were human. Every evening we whispered to each other about our families, about our hometowns, about what we would do after the war. This helped us not to break." Survival in such conditions required not only physical endurance, but also immense strength of spirit. And yet, despite all efforts, mortality in the Arctic camps was monstrous. According to various estimates, 40 to 60% of Soviet prisoners of war sent beyond the Arctic Circle did not live to see liberation. The harsh climate of the Arctic Circle became an additional executioner for Soviet prisoners of war. Here, where temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below zero and the polar night lasted for months, thousands of people were thrown into the heaviest work imaginable. The Nazis' main project in Norway was the infamous Blood Road, a strategic highway stretching along the coast from Kirkenes to Narvik. It got its name for a reason. Thousands of Soviet prisoners died during its construction. Work continued without interruption, in any weather. People, exhausted by hunger, in light clothing, cut clearings in the rocks, manually dragged multi-ton boulders, and laid the roadbed through swamps and mountain passes. Nikolai Vasilyev, one of the few surviving builders, recalled, "We worked like hell. The norm was 3 cubic meters of rock per day per person. Those who didn't meet it didn't get bread. Tools were a pickaxe and shovel. Many fell right at the workplace and never got up again." The second major project was the construction of airfields. In permafrost conditions, this task seemed impossible, but the Nazi command demanded results at any cost. Prisoners manually leveled sites for runways, dragged stones and laid concrete. In winter, they first had to build fires to thaw the frozen ground, and then work quickly before the ground froze again. Equally difficult was the labor in the nickel mines of Kirkenes and Alta. In dark adits cut into the permafrost, prisoners extracted strategically important raw materials for the German war industry. 12-hour shifts underground without sufficient ventilation, with the constant threat of collapses and in conditions of high humidity, led to mass diseases and deaths. A special challenge was the construction of coastal fortifications, part of the Atlantic Wall. Working waist-deep in the icy water of the northern fjords, prisoners installed anti-landing barriers, concreted gun emplacements, and built bunkers. Mortality at these facilities reached 20% per month. In the mountainous regions of Finnmark, prisoners were used to build underground shelters for German submarines. These bunkers were carved into the rocks and required enormous labor costs. Work was carried out around the clock in 3 shifts, without days off or holidays. A peculiarity of labor beyond the Arctic Circle was the light regime. In winter, work was carried out in the complete darkness of the polar night, under the light of searchlights or torches. In summer, during the polar day, when the sun did not set below the horizon, the working day extended to 16 to 18 hours. German engineers from the Todt organization, who supervised the construction, treated the prisoners as expendable material. Production norms were deliberately set to be impossible, and failure to meet them was punished by reducing the already meager rations or by corporal punishment. Despite the inhuman conditions, the prisoners found the strength to resist. The most common form was sabotage, deliberate slowing down of work, damaging tools, and sometimes even diversions at finished facilities. Such actions were extremely dangerous. Sabotage was punishable by execution, but despair pushed people to take risks. Even in the inhumane conditions of the northern camps, Soviet prisoners of war found the strength to resist. The forms of this resistance were varied, from passive sabotage to daring escapes and the organization of underground groups. The most common form of protest was sabotage. Prisoners deliberately slowed down work, damaged tools, and caused defects in construction. Ivan Smirnov, a former prisoner of the camp in Alta, recounted, "We added too much sand to the concrete so that it would crumble faster. We put rubbish into metal structures. Every day we came up with new ways to harm the enemy." In some camps, underground organizations emerged. Despite exhaustion and illness, prisoners created secret committees that maintained the morale of comrades, established contact with the Norwegian resistance, and planned escapes. Escapes from northern camps were rare and extremely dangerous. Fugitives had to overcome not only barbed wire and guards, but also the harsh nature of the Arctic. However, despair pushed people to take this step. One of the most famous was the escape of Mikhail Petrov's group from the Kirkenes camp in February 1943. 5 prisoners, taking advantage of a blizzard, overcame the fence and headed towards the Soviet border. For 3 weeks they walked through the snowy desert, feeding on what they could find in rare settlements. 2 died from the cold, but 3 managed to reach the front line. Another legendary escape was made by Vasily Barabanov's group from the Alta camp. 8 people, with the help of Norwegian underground fighters, managed to go into the mountains and create a small partisan detachment there. They operated for almost a year, attacking German transports and collecting intelligence for the Allies. Norwegians played a special role in organizing escapes. Despite the threat of execution, many local residents helped Soviet prisoners. They provided food, clothing, medicine, and sometimes weapons. The family of fisherman Olaf Jensen from Varanger Fjord sheltered fugitives in their home and then transported them closer to the Soviet border in a fishing boat. In the mountainous regions of Finnmark, an underground network created by Norwegian communists operated. They organized green corridors for fugitives, supplying them with maps, compasses, and guides. Thanks to this help, dozens of Soviet prisoners of war were able to reach neutral Sweden. Escapes intensified especially in 1944, when the front line approached the Norwegian border. In some cases, they became widespread. In June 1944, 26 people escaped from the Bjørnelva camp at once. Most of them were caught and shot, but 8 managed to join the Norwegian partisans. The fate of the fugitives varied. Those who reached Sweden had to face internment. They were placed in special camps until the end of the war. Those who joined the partisans continued the fight with weapons in hand. Many died from the bullets of their pursuers or from cold and hunger in the deserted mountains. After the war, the stories of these escapes remained unknown to the general public for a long time. In the USSR, former prisoners of war were treated with suspicion, and many preferred not to talk about their captivity and escapes. In Norway, however, the memory of Soviet fugitives and the Norwegians who helped them was carefully preserved in folk tales and the memoirs of resistance participants. Today, memorial signs have been installed at the sites of former camps and along escape routes. They remind us of the courage of people who, even in the most terrible conditions, did not submit to captivity and fought for their freedom and human dignity. An amazing relationship developed between Soviet prisoners of war and the local population of northern Norway. Despite the strictest prohibition from the German authorities, Norwegians found ways to help the tormented people behind the barbed wire. These contacts began with fleeting glances of sympathy and grew into a true support system that saved many lives. The first encounters took place at work sites, where prisoners toiled alongside local residents. Norwegians, themselves suffering under Nazi occupation, saw in Soviet soldiers not enemies, but fellow victims of fascism. Despite the language barrier, a silent mutual understanding arose between them. A vivid example of such a connection is the story of fisherman Gunnar Bergman from a village near Alta. Every morning, passing by the column of prisoners heading to work, he accidentally dropped bundles of bread and dried fish. The guards couldn't figure out for a long time where the emaciated prisoners were getting extra food. Little Solveig Larsson, a 12-year-old girl from Kirkenes, brought potatoes and carrots from her family's cellar to the camp fence. She hid behind stones and, seizing the moment, threw vegetables over the wire. Decades later, as an elderly woman, she recalled, "I didn't do it out of heroism. I just couldn't look at their hungry eyes." Gradually, the aid became more organized. The Norwegian resistance movement created special groups dedicated to supporting Soviet prisoners. They collected food, warm clothing, and medicine, and delivered them through trusted individuals: cleaners working in the camps, drivers delivering goods, local residents whose homes were near the camp zones. Norwegian medics played a special role. Dr. Hans Eriksson from Tromsø, who worked at the city hospital, secretly treated prisoners with severe illnesses. He falsified diagnoses indicating infectious diseases so that German authorities would permit hospitalization. In the hospital, prisoners received normal nutrition and treatment, which saved dozens of lives. The most dangerous form of aid was organizing escapes. Harboring escaped prisoners was punishable by execution, but this did not stop the Norwegians. The Johansen farmer family from the vicinity of Narvik hid 3 escaped Soviet soldiers in their barn for 2 years. They built a secret underground bunker where they hid the prisoners during raids. A network of underground routes, created by Norwegian patriots, allowed fugitives to be transported over the mountains to neutral Sweden. Local hunters and reindeer herders, who knew the mountain trails perfectly, often acted as guides. Some of these routes are now tourist trails, and memorial signs can be seen on the border stones. After the liberation of northern Norway by Soviet troops in the autumn of 1944, many local residents helped in the search and exhumation of the bodies of deceased prisoners. They pointed out mass graves, helped identify victims, and collected evidence of Nazi crimes. These relationships did not cease with the end of the war. Many surviving prisoners maintained contact with their Norwegian saviors for decades. They exchanged letters, photographs, and with the fall of the Iron Curtain, personal meetings also became possible. In the archives of Norwegian families, moving letters of gratitude from former prisoners and their relatives are still kept. The autumn of 1944 brought long-awaited liberation for thousands of Soviet prisoners of war in northern Norway. When units of the Red Army crossed the Norwegian border in October, the Germans began a hasty evacuation of the camps, destroying traces of their crimes. Many prisoners were shot on the spot, others were driven deeper into the country. But the Nazis did not manage to complete their plan. The rapid advance of Soviet troops caught them by surprise. Kirkenes and the surrounding camps were the first to be liberated. Artillery officer Alexei Voronin, who participated in the liberation, recalled, "What we saw cannot be put into words. Living skeletons in rags rushed towards us, cried, kissed our hands. Some could not walk and crawled towards us. We, who had seen everything at the front, could not hold back tears." The condition of the liberated was appalling. The average weight of an adult male was 40 to 45 kilograms. Many suffered from scurvy, tuberculosis, and frostbite. Doctors examining the former prisoners noted cases of irreversible mental disorders caused by the endured suffering. First aid was provided by medical battalions directly on site. Field hospitals were set up, where the most serious patients were brought. The Norwegian population actively participated in saving the former prisoners. They brought food, clothes, and provided their homes for housing the sick. By the spring of 1945, all of northern Norway had been liberated. The complex work of accounting for and repatriating former prisoners began. A special transit point was established in Murmansk, through which all those returning to their homeland passed. However, returning home for many became the beginning of new trials. In the Soviet Union, former prisoners of war were treated with suspicion. According to Stalin's Order Number 270 of August 1941, surrender was equated with treason. All repatriated individuals passed through NKVD filtration points, where they were interrogated about the circumstances of their capture and their behavior in the camps. Vasily Konovalov, who returned from Norwegian captivity, recounted, "We were met not as heroes who survived hell, but as potential traitors. The first question during the interrogation was, 'Why did you survive when so many others died?' As if surviving was a crime. Many former prisoners, after verification, were sent to penal battalions, where they were supposed to atone for their guilt with blood. Others were sent to labor camps to rebuild the destroyed country, effectively replacing one captivity with another. Only a few were able to return to their families without additional repression. The fate of those accused of collaborating with the enemy was particularly tragic. Even those who were forced to work as cooks or interpreters in the camp could receive long sentences. Former capos, and those who agreed to serve in the guard to survive, were often sentenced to the supreme penalty. For decades, former prisoners of war remained second-class citizens. It was difficult for them to get jobs, they were not admitted to the party, and the stigma of having been captured hung over them. Many hid their past even from their loved ones to avoid discrimination. Only in the late 1980s did the gradual rehabilitation of former prisoners of war begin. Restrictions were lifted, compensation was paid, and they were recognized as war veterans. But for many, this recognition came too late. Most had already passed away, never having lived to see justice. For many years, the memory of Soviet prisoners of war in Norway existed in two parallel worlds. In Norway itself, their fate was not forgotten. Local residents who helped the prisoners passed their memories down to subsequent generations. In the Soviet Union, however, this page of history remained semi-closed. It was preferred not to speak about it publicly. The first memorials at the sites of mass deaths of Soviet prisoners appeared in northern Norway as early as the 1940s. Simple stone obelisks with a red star were erected by local residents, often without official permission. They became places where Norwegians brought flowers on Victory Day and other commemorative dates. In the 1960s, The first official monument to Soviet prisoners of war, the Liberators of Finnmark Monument, was unveiled in Kirkenes. A Soviet delegation attended its opening, but there wasn't a single former prisoner among the guests. Their presence could have raised uncomfortable questions about the fate of the repatriated. A real breakthrough in preserving memory occurred in the 1980s. In Bjørnevatn, near Kirkenes, the Silveris Museet Museum was created, dedicated to the fate of Soviet prisoners who worked in local mines. The exhibition includes personal belongings of the deceased, photographs, documents, memoirs of survivors, and testimonies of local residents. Norwegian historians and local lore experts played a special role in preserving this memory. Professor Marianne Salime of the University of Tromsø spent decades collecting testimonies about the lives of Soviet prisoners. Her book, Soviet Prisoners of War in Norway, became the first fundamental study on this topic and was translated into Russian. In the 1990s, with the opening of archives, a new chapter began in the study of the fate of prisoners of war. Russian and Norwegian historians gained access to documents that had been classified as secret for many years. The names of thousands of deceased, previously considered missing, were established. An important step was the creation of the joint Russian-Norwegian database, Fates of Prisoners of War. This project combined archival materials from both countries and allowed relatives of the deceased to learn about the fate of their loved ones. Many families received information for the first time about where their fathers and grandfathers were buried. In the 2000s, Russia finally began to speak openly about the fate of prisoners of war. Memoirs of survivors were published, documentaries were made, and scientific conferences were held. The state officially recognized former prisoners as victims of war and granted them veteran status with all due benefits. However, the most touching testament to memory remains personal stories. Every year, descendants of former prisoners come to northern Norway to honor the memory of their ancestors. Local residents welcome them warmly and help them find places connected to their family history. Today, memorial signs are installed along the former Road of Blood, reminding of its terrible history. In schools in northern Norway, memory lessons are held where children are told about the fate of Soviet prisoners. Young Norwegians and Russians participate in joint expeditions to the sites of former camps, collecting and preserving historical evidence. The memory of Soviet prisoners of war in Norway has become a symbol of how two countries, despite political differences, can together preserve a common history. It is a memory not only of suffering, but also of humanity shown in the most inhumane circumstances.